Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. As the Biden administration passed its 6-month mark, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman is meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi on July 25th, with North Korea on the agenda. In her earlier trips to South Korea and Japan, Sherman highlighted the importance of the trilateral cooperation, not just in the context of North Korea, but also in the broader regional context as well. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Harry Harris, former U.S. ambassador to South Korea. Ambassador Harris also served as commander of U.S. Pacific Command. He was the first Asian American to hold 4-star rank in the U.S. Navy and the first to lead the U.S. Pacific Command. Scott Snyder also joins me today. Mr. Snyder is director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program. Pleasure to have you both.
It's great to be here, Liz. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
First of all, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman is visiting China and is meeting Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Ambassador Harris, do you expect there will be some substantial discussion about North Korea?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know, of course, but you can believe Wendy Sherman. She said herself, and according to the media in Korea, about her meeting with President Moon Jae-in, she said that she told him that clearly they would be talking. The Americans and the Chinese would be talking about North Korea. So I think you just have to believe her in that regard. I would also believe that all of the issues that we have with China, the PRC, will be on the table. I mean, this is an opportunity to have an important discussion, a high-level discussion, and I believe that Secretary Sherman is the right person to do that and hold those discussions with Wang Yi.
Mr. Snyder, North Korea has been considered one area where the U.S. and China share interests, despite the often tense relationship between the two countries. Mr. Snyder, will the two sides make progress on the North Korean issues?
Well, it's hard to say exactly how much progress they'll make at this particular meeting, but I think that simply putting North Korea into the bin of cooperation versus the bin of competition or being an adversary is probably a step forward. We know that the Chinese have appointed an ambassador for North Korea, so they're anticipating engagement with the U.S. on this. But I think we also have to be realistic because while China and the U.S. do have a limited shared interest in denuclearization, they don't necessarily share the same priorities or the same preferred outcomes on the peninsula. And so that, I think, will be a barrier. Ironically, it is in times where North Korea creates a crisis that the U.S. and China have found that they've been able to cooperate more.
Mm-hmm. When Sherman started out on her trip to Northeast Asia, it wasn't clear whether she'll be visiting China, and the schedule was fixed when she was in Tokyo. Why do you think this happened, Mr. Snyder? Did they come to the agreement late that they need to meet despite the current political environment?
Well, I would say it's an indicator of the level of political complexity around this dialogue between the U.S. and China at this stage. It's not necessarily uncommon for arrangements like this to be made at a late stage. But for both countries, I think that the relationship has been political. We've seen a kind of Chinese rebuff of the Secretary of Defense's effort to visit in the spring. And so I do think that it is notable that Deputy Secretary Sherman is going to be traveling to China. I think this is the first meeting that a senior Biden administration official is going to have with China in China. And so there is complexity around the relationship, but I think that both governments are also showing a commitment to move forward with dialogue in that context.
Right. Ambassador Harris, Secretary of Antony Blinken earlier talked with Yang Jiechi, Director of China's Central Foreign Affairs Commission Office, and Sung Kim, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, talked with his Chinese counterpart Liu Xiaoming recently. And now Sherman is meeting Wang Yi. Why is it important for the U.S. and China to communicate, especially on North Korea?
Well, I mean, it's the heart of the security in Northeast Asia, right? I mean, we fundamentally disagree with the PRC, but we also cooperate on a number of issues. And one of those areas of cooperation is North Korea. You know, we have tough sanctions in place against North Korea for all the right reasons, in my opinion. But those sanctions are not American sanctions, they're United Nations sanctions. And that requires China's buy-in, the PRC's buy-in. So I think it's important that dialogue between two great powers get underway. I think Max Hastings, a few months ago, he says the diplomatic relationship between Washington and Beijing is poor, and there's little hope of a grand bargain. But that's no reason not to have dialogue. It's important to have dialogue. You know, at the height of the Cold War, we had a dialogue with the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill famously said that talk is better than shoot. And so it's important to have those dialogues at every level. And again, I go back to what I said before. I think that Secretary Sherman is the right person to lead that effort at this time. So I'm encouraged by the fact that she and Wang Yi are going to meet, and I'm optimistic and hopeful for a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, you mentioned about the sanctions, and China has been pushing for easing sanctions on North Korea for a while. Do you think the sanctions need to be eased in order to bring North Korea to the table?
I do not. I believe that it's important to maintain the strongest sanctions that we can. Now, interestingly, Victor Cha just wrote in Chosun that North Korea has self-imposed sanctions on itself, really because of COVID. Tougher sanctions than anyone in the previous administration could even dream about. So that's an interesting take from Victor's very learned perspective. I believe that tough sanctions are essential in the case of North Korea. I do believe that sanctions relaxation could be an outcome of negotiations, but you should not relax sanctions to entice the North to negotiate. So let that be an outcome of negotiations, a successful negotiation of some sort, and then we can go from there. But let's not repeat failed history by relaxing sanctions just to get them to the table in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what's your thought on what just Ambassador said?
Well, I agree with Ambassador Harris on that. I think that is really the conventional wisdom around the U.S. Thinking on sanctions toward North Korea. You could make an argument that there's a need for a revamp to the sanctions regime since it was put in place in 2018. But it would be very hard to achieve that because it would require cooperation from China and Russia. And when I say revamp, I'm saying that I think that there are some areas where the sanctions actually need to be strengthened in order to pinpoint the leadership more directly. And there are other areas where they could be loosened. But the mechanisms are there for humanitarian aid to go forward. As Ambassador Harris suggested, the biggest challenge is the policy decision on the North Korean side to refuse assistance. And so I think that if the North Koreans are ready to open up to humanitarian aid, the sanctions need not be an obstacle to that flow.
Mm-hmm. Sherman stressed the importance of the trilateral coordination among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. She said it sends a very critical message to North Korea. Mr. Snyder, why does the Biden administration seem to be more eager to boost up the cooperation among these three countries?
Well, it's really a response to the perception that North Korea has long pursued a wedge-driving strategy in order to divide alliance partners. And I think we also have to remember that Deputy Secretary Sherman was involved back in the late 1990s when the idea of the Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group was introduced by former Defense Secretary Perry. And that really has been, I think, the foundation for promotion of trilateral coordination ever since. And so it's not surprising at all that Deputy Secretary Sherman would emphasize that, or that the Biden administration would be focused on that. It's also a way of trying to overcome some of the difficulties in the Japan-South Korea relationship in order to make sure that those difficulties don't become an obstacle to moving forward on policy toward North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, based on your experience, both as the ambassador to South Korea as well as the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, the way how the Biden administration has been emphasizing this trilateral relationship, is this distinctive compared to the past administrations?
That I'm pleased with the Biden administration's approach at the very beginning of its time in office, and that is that relationships matter and alliances matter. If you go back to World War II, to just after World War II, it's the network of U.S. alliances and partnerships in the region that has been at the core of a stable and peaceful Indo-Pacific. And I believe that no country in the region can shape the future of the region in isolation by itself. The reality is, and I've talked about this in speeches in my time in office in Seoul as well as in uniform, the reality is that no important security or economic issue in the region can be resolved without the active participation of Tokyo and Seoul. And so, I believe the relationship between the United States and our two alliance partners, Japan and South Korea, matter. And that's why I'm pleased that the Biden administration is emphasizing this important trilateral relationship.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, to follow up on that, both South Korea and Japan governments made it clear that it is important to cooperate with each other, but it doesn't seem to work out that way. We all know that there are historical wounds between South Korea and Japan. Is there any way to overcome this?
Well, it's unfortunate that President Moon canceled his trip or did not go to Tokyo this week for the opening of the Olympics. And I think that, after the Olympics, both countries, Japan and South Korea, will turn to internal politics and upcoming elections and all that. So they'll be distracted internally and will be unable to reach any important agreement externally and with each other. The United States has long encouraged both of our allies in the region, Japan and South Korea, to put aside their historical differences, not to ignore them, but to put them aside, to focus on important economic and security issues that affect all three countries in the region. And the United States should and can act as an interlocutor or as a mediator between Seoul and Tokyo. However, we can't want it more than they want it. So it is up to Seoul and Tokyo to reach an agreement, to figure out how to negotiate these very thorny, complex, historic issues between the two countries to move forward together to address the pressing current issues that affect security and economics, not only in the region, but globally.
Mm-hmm. While urging North Korea to engage, Wendy Sherman indicated the U.S. will exercise some patience, perhaps not too much, but some. Ambassador, is the Biden administration trying to say their policy is different from the so-called strategic patience from the Obama administration?
If you characterize the Obama administration's view as strategic patience, and if you characterize the Trump administration's approach as all or nothing with North Korea, I think that the Biden administration's approach falls in between that. And I appreciate the Biden administration's view of this constructive, predictable way ahead that's important that Wendy Sherman talked about. It's important to have a solutions-based approach to dealing with North Korea, as Kirk Campbell characterized it. So I'm excited by the opportunities. I do think that the Biden administration's approach is a practical approach, solutions-based approach, if you will, that falls in between the strategic patience on the one hand and all or nothing or on the other. So I think it's the right way to go. It encourages dialogue with the North. The Biden administration has said repeatedly that they're open to dialogue with the North anytime and anywhere. But the ball is in North Korea's court, for sure.
Mr. Snyder, how would you interpret what Wendy Sherman said to North Korea?
Well, I interpret Wendy Sherman's comments as a form of recognition that the circumstances around North Korea coming out for diplomatic engagement remain adverse. They're very much focused on their internal problems. They haven't yet come to the conclusion that they are ready to engage diplomatically. And it may take a little bit of time. And that is a factor that is, frankly, beyond the control of the Biden administration to a great degree. And so really, other than putting the ball into North Korea's court, the only thing as a practical matter that Biden administration officials can do is wait and hope that North Korea tries to return the serve.
Mr. Snyder, do you think North Korea is now situated at where it can make some moves towards talks?
I think there may be some initial evidence that the North Koreans could be positioning themselves to reach out. We know that there's a need internally for some outreach. And I think that the North Koreans may be moving in the direction of not necessarily opposing all contact. But we have to wait and see exactly how things are going to develop. It's clear that it's going to take a signal from the top for North Korean diplomacy to be activated. It may not be a public signal, but it definitely is a decision that Kim Jong-un has to make.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, you earlier said the ball is now in North Korea's side. Is there any next move that U.S. can take in order to bring North Korea to the table?
Look, I think that the United States has been very clear that we would be willing to meet with North Korea anytime, anywhere, without preconditions. I mean, you can't get more clear than that. We're working with South Korea. Secretary Sherman is just left South Korea, I think, today. She's going to go to the PRC in a day or two after, I think, Mongolia next. And so, we're doing all that can be done, I believe. So it is truly up to North Korea. As mentioned before, as Victor Cha said, on the one hand, those who would favor a relaxation of sanctions, North Korea has self-imposed strong sanctions because of COVID. Similarly, North Korea has imposed a no dialogue, no face-to-face dialogue policy because of COVID. So it's hard, I think, to achieve any breakthrough at this time. But the United States, I believe, has been forthright and has honestly opened the door for dialogue with North Korea. So I hope that North Korea will go through that open door. This goes back to the work that Steve Biegun and his counterparts, including Lee Hoon from South Korea, did during the Trump administration and the Singapore summit and all of that good work. And I'm pleased that the Biden administration has used the Singapore summit as the opening position for dialogue with North Korea. So it really is at North Korea's court. Again, we can't want it more than they want it. The opportunities are there for a brighter future for North Korea, but they have to take some positive steps and walk through that open door that the Biden administration has left for them.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, my last question for you today. Pentagon said there has been no change to the schedule of the U.S. ROK joint military exercise in August. However, some lawmakers in South Korea are calling for postponement of the joint military exercises. What do you make of this situation?
Yeah, I think those that call for postponement of exercises, I think they are naive. Look, it's okay for hope to be a course of action, as long as it's not the only course of action. You know, you have to have idealism that's rooted in realism. That's just the reality of the world in which we live. I think that again, I go back to my earlier comment about sanctions relief. Postponement or reduction of military exercises are fine if they're the outcome of negotiations, of fruitful negotiations between the United States and North Korea, informed by our ally South Korea. But to reduce exercises or even eliminate them as an inducement to get North Korea to come back to the negotiating table is a flawed strategy and will fail almost at the get-go. So I think that it's important that we have those exercises. These exercises are not for our benefit. They're not for South Korea's benefit. They are for the alliance's benefit in order to ensure that we have the military readiness to counter any threat from North Korea. And North Korea has proven that it has the wherewithal to conduct provocations, and they have the weaponry to pose a real threat to our alliance. So it's important that we exercise our capability to meet that threat. And then, meanwhile, separately, you know, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Separately, let's open the door. Let's keep the door open to dialogue and hope that North Korea will walk through that open door and then engage in discussions. And then if the outcome of those discussions are a reduction of exercises, fine. Just like if an outcome of that dialogue is an elimination of certain sanctions, fine. But let's not give it away before we have that those negotiations.
Mr. Snyder, same question for you.
Well, I agree strongly with what Ambassador Harris has said about the alliance as the right framework for dealing with this. I think the Moon administration needs to beware of what I would call North Korea first influences on its policies, just as the U.S. Benefits from not pursuing an America first policy when it comes to alliance issues. And so, you know, I really think that those two domestic influences have begun to emerge as perhaps the greatest threat to the alliance that it faces, more than the challenge from North Korea and China. And so we really need to be aware of that. And I think that the legislators' call for suspension of military exercises at this time falls into that category of a North Korea first approach rather than an alliance approach.
Mm-hmm. The United States, South Korea, and Japan agreed to deepen their trilateral cooperation in achieving the complete and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. As the U.S. urges the two countries to work cooperatively on common regional and international priorities, it remains to be seen how South Korea and Japan will overcome the wounds that run deep over their history. Ambassador Harris and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. This has been very helpful to me, and great seeing you, Scott, and thanks, Liz.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.